The Americas are a world away from the rest of the old world, depicted in world maps. America was not on those world maps, but there was hints of America being talked about by several different people. Now, I've talked about how people from the Australian regions knew about America, but outside of those places, is it possible to get to America even by accident? Well, let's read this. April 15, 2023. Journalists retrace fateful journey of a group of 43 African migrants lost at sea. A new AP investigation highlights the desperate and sometimes deadly journey many African migrants are taking across the Atlantic in search of a better life in Europe. The reporting centers on a boat that drifted thousands of miles off course from the coast of Mauritania to the Caribbean island of Tobago. Journalists Renata Brito and Felipe Dana join John Yang to discuss the story. Wealth inequality in some of these countries has forced some people to try their luck somewhere else. And one of the places that they usually try is Europe, to try and find a better job so they can take care of their family and friends and everybody else in their country. Their countries are not so far apart from Europe, and so they imagine that through ships they could easily get to Europe. The problem is there's something called the trade winds, named by the Europeans, though they have other names prior to that. These winds blew these migrants in a direction which would have been favorable for anyone who was trying to get to America, and it took them straight to South America, and they landed exactly in Tobago. Another problem is it's not the only time it's happened. Several Nigerian boats have been stranded or taken, washed away, swept away by these winds. In this case, the boat capsized and most of them died. But in Harrison Okene's case, it's a very different thing. He was rescued on the side of Brazil in the coast after traveling 5,000 kilometers in 14 days from Nigeria's coast all the way to Brazil. In Brazil, he was rescued, given water and food. Unfortunately, 11 people that were with him died. This tells you how easy it is to travel with a well prepared boat from Nigeria all the way to the Americas. Harrison Okene, a 29-year-old cook, was the sole survivor of a Jackson 4 which overturned after being battered by heavy swells last month. 11 other crew members died as the vessel sank some 12 miles (20 kilometers) off Nigeria's mangrove-lined coast. It was around 5 a.m. and I was on a toilet when the vessel just started going down. The speed was so fast, Okene said by the phone from his hometown of Wari. Scrambling out, he was unable to reach an emergency exit hatch and watched in horror as 3 crew members were sucked in churning sea. He had been underwater for almost 60 hours when he heard a hammering on the deck. A team of South African divers scouring the waters on a presumed body recovery operation were shocked to hear faint hammering in reply. Stories about people being swept away all the way to Brazil and faraway places in the Atlantic go back hundreds and hundreds of years. it's unknown why some people don't believe that these people could have made it to the other side, dead or alive, when in modern times they almost always make it because of these winds that push you to the other side. They don't beg you. If you go far enough off of the coast, you're going to America, whether you like it or not. And of course, the trade winds work the other way around too. That if you're in America and you happen to be completely off of the coast in a very far away area, you're getting swept all the way to Africa or possibly Europe. Even back when Christopher Columbus was sailing, and obviously he didn't just go there unprepared, he had heard stories about how you could get across to India from Africa, traveling from this coast and moving all the way around the world because there was these winds that had already been discovered before he even traveled to America. Spain, Portugal, Africa, North Africa, they were all aware of it. And in fact, in the eastern side of things, the Muslims were aware of it too, and they were talking about it. Of course, there were heroes such as Koshkosh, and of course the story about the African who went to America on a giant boat. Now, of course, America was not known. The continent that was on the other side was speculated, and some people who had been swept and returned, like Koshkosh, spoke that there are entire cities and civilizations on the other side of the world. It was also estimated that there must have been some land because it would have been one of the biggest oceans if there wasn't a piece of land on the other side. In the same way that some people guessed that Antarctica must have existed, that there must have been some place or some land on the other side. There are a couple of problems with the way that we interpret or look at the history of these people traveling to America from Nigeria. Let's start with a couple. Now, first of all, we do not expect them to have made a triumphant return and wrote a bunch of maps, of course, except from hearsay. But let's just look at the old maps and see. So from Al Idrisi, we see here a map. At the bottom, we see Africa. This map, by the way, would be upside down. That's why the words are upside down. But if we face it right way around, then we get back to the Earth as we see it. You will notice that the Zanj regions are nowhere to be found. So Africa is cut off. And you will notice that if you go in out from Africa through Egypt, you can see there the River Nile. Out there you get Arabia, and then you get the rest of Europe, and it cuts off at Japan. So the limits that are known are at Japan. Second problem is there's a lot of forgers in this world. In other words, there are people who want things to be true, and so they force them. For instance, this is an obvious forgery done by a person who said they discovered this map in 2003, and they said it was a recreation by a European in the 1800s of Zheng He's mission. Firstly, why would he recreate it in Chinese, which is my first question, and then secondly, it's too specific, it's too well known, it's too well rounded, and Zheng He's missions never reached America, not in any real sense. Were there people in Zheng He's time who could go to China and America? I absolutely believe that. There is no way that they couldn't. We see people coming from America to the Polynesian regions, and we know the Polynesians had contact with Indonesians who had contact with the Chinese. And of course, I've talked about that little chart which had the Cape of Good Hope, China, Spain, America, and it had Indonesia and Australia. which is scary given the fact that it was written down by Albuquerque. Before Guinea was colonized, the colonizers were the Africans who colonized Spain and the Iberian regions. Now, here's a question. Today, we know that the people with their sophistication and all of that, the boat still gets swept away to Brazil. What is the likelihood that every single boat that used to go from Africa all the way to Europe, every single one of them made it there with no complications, especially since when we start to see writings by Europeans who try to go back and forth between the Kingdom of Congo, they find themselves being swept all over the place. Some of them even land as far as England and they're trying to go to Spain. I think I did a horrible job last time of setting up the stage. I think I read this letter without giving full context. That 1512 is a pretty early time. So if we move away from the west of Africa and we go to the Indian Ocean or the Ethiopian Ocean, we can see that, of course, we have Alfonso de Albuquerque, one of the earliest Europeans to reach Goa, and he talked about how there was a chart that had in it written Brazil, Java, and the Cape of Good Hope, which is strange because, of course, the Europeans had never really been to these parts. And I want to show you the true context of what I'm talking about. So, like I showed you, that writing is from 1512. That's when it was the letter was sent to, back to Portugal. Now, if you read here, Diego Chao was the first European to discover the mouth of Congo in 1482. So this is the important part to do the math. 1482 is when Diego Chao reached the Congo River. Not when they reached India. They had no idea that you could go around Africa and reach India. They weren't even sure that there was land south of Guinea. And this was the first time they had reached Congo. Now, Diego Chao had conversations with the people who lived there, and of course, they talked about how there were other people who came from other parts of the world from the bottom of the ocean, but it's not clear exactly who these people are. Diego Chao, in his lifetime, didn't write that much about his journey, so it's lost exactly who these people were. So, of course, I talked about the chart that was mentioned by Alfonso de Albuquerque. But again, let's put it in context. 1489. That's the day that, or the date, the year that Diego Chao reaches Congo. And he didn't even stay there for a while. He went back. 1492, that's when Christopher Columbus reaches the Americas. 1498, Vasco da Gama reaches India. 1500 is the discovery of Brazil by Pedro Cabral, and 1512 is when this chart is reported by Alfonso de Albuquerque. Now let's go back one more time. 1489 is when Congo is first discovered in the torrid zone where they thought people didn't exist. 1492 is when they reach the Americas. 1498 is when they first reach India in Goa. 1500 is when they reach Brazil for the first time, and 1512 is when they have a chart with Brazil on the chart, and the chart is a Javanese chart, meaning that it's not even written in the language of the Europeans. And it stunned them because clearly these people had knowledge about America that had not come from the Europeans. In conclusion, there's definitely more to the story about America, and it's possible that the heightening of Christopher Columbus is a sort of insecurity about what might have happened prior to this person. And of course, his achievement is still pretty good for what he was trying to achieve. But of course, there's so many other people who came before him that he even admits using their navigation skills to try and understand the seas and oceans. There is but one more date that is important, but I'll mention it after I read this. In this first letter I send you, a greater letter, in which I give you an account of everything I have done since the departure of the ships from Duarte de la Mo and Ganchola, whatever that name is, de Sequeira, until my return from Malacca to Cochin. It was begun in Malacca and finished in Cochin, and your Highness forgive me if in the same letter and manner you fail to report to me in those two places, of which the letter mentions that I am waiting for you, due to the great work that is to be done, and to inform your Highness at length that I have to be careful all day and all night about other things. I am also sending you, sir, a standard from the island of Goa, from Dio, and from the island of Kambaya Canal, who promises you the strength of security of your factory. I also bring you a piece of a standard that was taken from a large chart by a pilot from Java, which had the Cape of Good Hope, Portugal, and the land of Brazil, the Purple Sea and the Persian Sea, the island of Clove, the navigation of the Chinese and the Gores, with their lines and straight paths through which the nation sailed, and the hinterlands which kingdoms joined one another. It seems to me, sir, that it was the best thing I have ever seen, and your Highness would have been very pleased to see it, had the names with the letter Java, and I brought Java who knew how to read and write, sending this piece to your Highness, which Francisco Rodriguez placed on the other, so that your Highness can truly see the Chinese come from where and the Gores, and your nations have no way of going make pair the island of Clove and the gold mines Omsum and the island of Java. So some important information from this is where they are and where they claim they've seen and the piloting of it. Keep in mind, this pilot from Java who is doing this and making this map, he's doing it this early with this much detail, according to Alfonso de Albuquerque, who, why would he just throw in a joke in the middle of him explaining to his people who financed him that there's a pilot from Java who made a map? So this is a serious thing. I want you to keep that in mind. And then also he stresses how it's like internal maps, meaning it's maps that show how to get from where they come from to these lands, how to start from Java to Brazil. Remember, the Japanese didn't go to South America until way later. Everybody didn't until way later than this date. So there's something very, very, very important. I think the first time the Japanese actually landed in America was when William Adams helped them land in Mexico. Now, of course, there's some interesting things that we can see here, but a second interesting thing is, let's just read this part again. I also bring you a piece of standard that was taken from a large chart by a pilot from Java, which had the Cape of Good Hope, Portugal, and the land of Brazil. This is the part that's very interesting. It has the Cape of Good Hope, Portugal, and the land of Brazil. Except the interest there is a little bigger than I think a lot of people think, because he only mentions places that are important to him. Unfortunately for us, there's some places that he doesn't mention that were on the chart that he didn't actually care about as much as others. It was a big deal for the Portuguese to land in the Cape of Good Hope. So, of course, he's from Portugal, so he's happy that it's on there. Brazil is recently discovered, so he's also happy that Brazil is on this chart. And then, of course, he talks about the Persian Sea and all of that. But it's important to realize that this might have been one of the fullest or one of the most well understood pathways prior to the Europeans ever arriving. I can show you maps from China. I can show you maps from Persia, from Arabia, even from Spain, Portugal, everywhere. And none at this time was as detailed, or none prior to this time was as detailed. It was only when the Europeans finally charted it out that it became clear how the world was and how it was going to look from now on. And remember, Brazil is kind of on the wrong side for it to have just been like a, oh, they sort of landed in America. Brazil is on the other side for the Indonesians. Let's get a map so that we can put this in a very, very detailed way. Okay, so that's Indonesia in orange. That's Brazil in green. Think about the distances here. Except, of course, if they went the other way around, which now there's evidence, mounting evidence, that, by the way, some of the evidence is as old as from like 1993, but was ignored at the time because people thought it was like a far fetched idea, and now it's coming back as a true idea. But you can see there the orange of Indonesia and the green of Brazil. It's almost impossible to imagine that this Javanese sailor, keep in mind he was a pilot, the person that Albuquerque was talking about, it's hard to imagine that he went through the Indian Ocean, landed at the Cape of Good Hope, and then went to Brazil from there. For those of you who don't know, that's the Cape of Good Hope.